gave me such an important part in this time. Go to my people Israel and say to them to build my temple.
Ja, es ist sehr bedrückend und sehr schlimm, was Martin Luther hier formuliert.
Oh, well, let me go back. Acts 7:38. Look at this. Acts is the New Testament. Am I right? And look what it says. Talking about Moses. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness. What? In 1500 BC, there was a church? I don't think so. Guess what the word is there? Ecclesia. They decided ecclesia should be translated as church. All right? But there's a problem with that. Look at Acts 19:32. This is where they were worshiping the great goddess Diana for several hours. And in Acts 19:32, some of them cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused. Well, guess what? The word is ecclesia, but they go, oops, we can't put church in because they'll think the church was confused and the church are worshiping Diana. So we're going to translate it like it's supposed to be as assembly. And then in Acts 19:39, it says, if you inquire anything concerning other matters, it'll be determined in a lawful assembly. And guess what the Greek word is? Ecclesia. Well, we can't put church here now again because they'll think that the church was the one that was worshiping the great goddess Diana. How many of you believe the media is biased? So were the translators. Do you know in the Septuagint, which was written when? A couple hundred years before the New Testament, the word ecclesia is there over 98 times. And yet there were no churches. So ecclesia never meant church. It always meant what? Assembly. Yes, there were believing assemblies. Some people think, what? You don't believe in the church? Yes, I believe in the assembly of believers. But the media uses words that have other meanings. How many of you know they've tried to manipulate you through words? Well, the translators into English were just as biased. Just like there's bias today and prejudice today. That's why you always want to go back to the original text. Now, let me give you another example. This is one of my favorite examples of what replacement theology has done to us. How many of you like the begats? How many of you focus on the begats? Man, I memorized all the begats. I love the begats. The problem with the begats for Christians is the words. In Genesis 5, it mentions the begats. Adam begat Seth, who begat Enosh, who begat Canaan, who begat Mahalalel, who begat Yared, who begat Enoch, who begat Methuselah, who begat Lamech, who begat Noah. And how many of you got anything out of that? Oh, good. One of you did. Okay, the problem is in the English, we transliterate, we don't translate. And what's the difference between transliterate and translate? Transliterate is take the phonics and put them into your language. Translate means to give the meaning of the name. Adam in Hebrew means mankind. Hi, I'm mankind. Remember Cain killed Abel? And Seth was appointed to take his place? It says in Genesis that Seth was appointed to take Abel's place. Well, guess what Seth's name means? He's appointed to. Hi, I'm appointed to. That's what his name is. But we don't put in the English what the translation is, and so we miss the whole meaning of these names. He begat Enosh, which means feeble, frail, mortal. He begat Canaan, which means a fixed dwelling place, like a house compared to a tent. So here in English, we go Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan. But in Hebrew, I just said mankind is appointed to feeble, frail mortality, a fixed dwelling place. All of a sudden it has meaning. He begat Mahaliel. That means God who is praised. Who begat Yared, which means to come down or descend. He begat Enoch. How many of you heard of Hanukkah? Enoch comes from Hanukkah, and Enoch means to train or instruct, to be a teacher. You're instructing and training. Then we have Methuselah, okay, Shalach, where you get, Shalach means to be shot forth or sent forth, okay? Met is death. So that Methuselah means he's sent to die, and he died a week before the flood. Lamech means to be beaten and tortured. Noah means to bring rest, a quiet peace. So now when you say these 10 generations in Hebrew, you're saying mankind is appointed to feeble, frail, mortality, fixed dwelling place. God who is praised comes down to instruct us. He was sent to die, being beaten and tortured to bring us rest and a quiet peace. You are not going to get that in the English. You're only going to get that from the Hebrew. I love the begats. There's so many amazing things, but that's what replacement theology has done to us. Now, Passover, again, replacement theology has messed that all up. They'll celebrate the resurrection a month before he dies. So this is why replacement theology is very important to understand all of the traditions of things that are going on. In Exodus 12, verse 15 on your notes, it says, 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. The first day you're to put away the leaven out of your house. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that soul will be cut off from Israel. That's pretty serious, okay? Well, let's look at this. What they would do, because of that statement, a few days before that cutoff came, they would begin to get all the leaven out of their house, preparing themselves for the feast of unleavened bread. And so what they would do, they would take, in Hebrew, it's known as bedekat chametz, the removal of the leaven. And so you can see a picture of Dad here, and he's got a child, a little daughter there, and he has a candle. And he takes a wooden spoon, and he's got a feather and a linen cloth. And Mom purposely hides some leaven. You can see the leaven down here. So Mom purposely hides the leaven, and then Dad gets a candle and he lights it. And the children have the feather and the wooden spoon and the linen cloth. And then the kids find it. And so after they find it, he says, "Okay, we got to remove the leaven." It says in the Bible that they were to teach their children about Passover. So they incorporate this in it to make it fun and memorable for the kids. So as soon as the kid reaches out to touch the leaven, Dad goes, "No, don't you touch it." Dad says, "Let me handle it." And he takes the feather out and he scoops the little crumb and puts it on the wooden spoon. Then he wraps it in a linen cloth and they take it outside. So here we have the tools needed: the candle, which is the light of the Torah. The feather, that's the Holy Spirit with its wings. The leaven, that's our sin. The wooden spoon, that represents the cross. The linen cloth represents what he's been wrapped in, and then he's taken outside of the camp and he's buried. And there's a communal burnt offering. All the Jews, basically to this day, it's called what is called the Bir Chametz, which is the burning of the leaven. Everybody in the neighborhood, there'd be one leaven pile. And they take all the leaven after they do that, even this day, and they put it in a pile and they burn it because they want to get all the leaven out of the house before Passover. All right? If you don't know the Jewish traditions, you don't realize it. They know the traditions, but they don't realize what it pertains to. See, so both the Christians have one eye open, and the Jews have one eye open, and the first group to look through both of them gets to see the whole picture. But the prejudice keeps us away from seeing the other side. When Jesus drove all the money changers out of the temple, can anyone tell me what month of the year that was? What month do you think Jesus drove all the money changers out of the temple? He's got his whip out. He's driving all the money changers out. It was at Passover. He's getting the leaven out of his dad's house. You will never forget that. Okay? So the whole idea was, oh, thank you. He was getting leaven out of the house. He was doing the very thing all the Jews have done traditionally for 1,500 years before he came. Isn't that amazing? That whole idea of getting leaven out of the house is where it got the concept of spring cleaning. That's what it came from. Now get a load of this. John 2, 13 and 15, there it is. And the Jews, Passover was at hand. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. He found the temple, those selling oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, the sheep, the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. It was a Passover. Now you will never forget when that happened. He's cleaning the leaven out of his dad's house. Now get a load of this. If you remember, what day were they to grab the Passover lamb? The 10th of Nisan. Passover is the 14th. But on the 10th of Nisan, they were to take their lamb, and what were they to do for 4 days? They had to inspect the lamb. Nisan 10, they brought the lamb home, and then for 4 days they inspected it. This is back in the original Exodus. Okay. Well, look at this. Matthew 26, 59 and 60. They've taken Yeshua from the Mount of Olives, and it says, now the chief priests, the elders, all the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, but they what? Found none. Though many false witnesses came, they found none. And at the last came these two false witnesses. Look at Luke 23, 4. He comes. Well, first off, here he is. All these scribes and priests are trying to find false witnesses, but they find no fault in him. Then he comes before Herod and Pilate. And it says in Luke 23, 4, then said Pilate to the chief priests, I find no fault in this man. Verse 15, no, nor yet Herod, for I said you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. And then when we go to the thief on the cross in Luke 23, 41, it says, we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing amiss. So we see Yeshua during the exact time of the inspection of the lamb was found to be a lamb without blemish. And it happened at the very time of the inspection of the lamb. And what's interesting, the lamb was held for how many days? And 4,000 years, and the day of the Lord is 1,000 years, was when Messiah came. There's all of these connections. There's the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's a picture. These are 2,000-year-old trees. Many of these may have been just little olive trees back in Yeshua's day. How many of you have been to the Garden of Gethsemane? I think everyone knows this verse. Matthew 26, 30. It's at the Last Supper. They sang a hymn, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. They sang a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. Anyone have any idea the words to that song? You all know the words? Does anybody not know the words to the song that they sang? When you get rid of replacement theology, you know. First off, guess what? The Lord had King David compose the funeral hymns that would be sung at Yeshua's funeral 1,000 years in advance. That's right. The hymns, the Psalms, was their songbook. And the Hallel is what they would sing every Passover, which is Psalms 113 through Psalms 118. So Psalm 118 was the last hymn at the Last Supper, because that is the last hymn that's been sung at the Last Supper for 2,000 years or more since David, 3,000 years. All right. So what do we find in Psalm 118? I think it's interesting. You remember, here they sang a hymn and they went over to the Mount of Olives, right? And that's where he was betrayed. That's where he was rejected. So what was the final hymn that they sang before he went over to the Mount of Olives? Psalm 118, 22 through 24. The stone the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. Wow, that's the very words when he was betrayed. And they sing it 3 times a day. And the following morning, at 9 in the morning, it says in Mark, that it was at 9 in the morning the third hour of the day, that they crucified him. Well, guess what? 9 in the morning, the very moment they nailed him to the stake, is the time of the morning sacrifice. At that very same moment, you can see the high priest there, and they take the Passover lamb that's going to be slain at 3 in the evening, they tie him, they bind him to the altar. So at the very moment that he's being nailed to the cross at 9 in the morning, Josephus says there were 2 million Jews there all around Jerusalem, and they were all a choir singing. As Yeshua is being nailed to the cross, what does he hear everybody singing? Psalm 118. The Lord is God. He's given us light, bind the sacrifice with cords, even to the horns of the altar. That's what they're singing while they're nailing him to the cross. That's what they're singing while they're binding the Passover lamb to the altar. And then what do we see? At noon, that's when all the lights go out. At high noon, everything goes black for 3 hours. And while he's suspended between heaven and earth, he hears everybody singing. And what are they singing? Psalm 118, the right hand of the Lord is lifted up. The right hand of the Lord does valiantly. That's what he's singing, where they've lifted him up in the air. And then at 3 in the evening is the time of the evening sacrifice. And that's when he dies. And so, boom, it's 3 o'clock. And as he gives his last breath, what is he hearing everyone sing? Let Israel now say, his loving kindness endures forever. Let Aaron in the house say, his loving kindness endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his loving kindness endures forever. 1,000 years before King David had him write this song, 1,000 years before he came. Now, these kinds of things with replacement theology, you don't connect. As a matter of fact, how many of you remember the veil of the temple rent from top to bottom? Remember that? Well, let me show you something. This is an ancient painting. It's called a Keria. It's where Jacob is tearing his clothes while the 11 sons say Joseph died, right? Well, he thinks Joseph got torn by beasts. And so what does he do? Keria is the rending of the garments, where he's tearing his clothes, revealing a broken heart over the death of his son. That's what the veil of the temple was. He was rending his garment, the father, over the death of his son. That was the purpose of the rending of the veil. Now, here's the other thing. Josephus records 250,000 lambs were slain for Passover. That's 250,000 lambs. There were 2.5 million people in Jerusalem, 10 people to a lamb. You got 250,000 lambs. Now, I don't know how much blood a lamb has, but if there's 250,000 lambs and they have 1 quart, that's 62,500 gallons of blood. That's equivalent to over 1,155-gallon barrels. Now, in the temple where they're slaying it, where's all that blood going to go? They'd be swimming in blood. At the base of the altar, there were 4 holes, channels, that before the blood coagulated, while it's hot and liquid, they would throw it down those holes, drain holes, and they would go underneath the temple where there were giant cisterns. Let me show you this. There are 3 valleys. There's the Kidron, everyone's familiar with, next to the Mount of Olives. That's the Valley of Blood, the Hinnom Valley, because that's where all the blood went. The Dung Gate is on this end of the temple, and it went downhill, and it's called the Dung Gate because that's where all the sewage and everything went. And so all this blood is like a river flowing down into the valley of blood. Okay? That's the Tyropian Valley in the middle, which is now gone because it's been filled with dirt and there's Muslim houses built on it. But here's the thing. He died on the Mount of Olives. He didn't die in the back 40. Okay, so he's looking into his father's face, and that's why the father, when he sees his son, rends his garment. Underneath, they found all these cisterns. Some of these cisterns would hold 10,000 gallons of water, and it'd be like flushing the toilet. Okay, all that blood's going down there. They release the water from the cistern, and there'd be a gigantic river of blood and water that is flowing into the valley of blood. And so at the very moment Yeshua, blood and water, is flowing from his right side, there's a massive flow, a river of blood and water falling from the Father's right side. He's in the Holy of Holies. And I'll close with these two verses. I think it's interesting. The Torah portion today is akev, anakov, which means heel. And look at Psalm 41:9. It's really all about the death of Messiah. It says, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which ate of my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And then look at John 13:18. The Messiah refers to that very verse. I speak not of you all, I know whom I've chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. And this is why he shared the bread with Judas. But with that said, that just is a touch of what replacement theology has done. It's erased all the connections of the names being translated, of the Passover. And this is why the Easter bunny instead of the Messiah. And this is why he can resurrect before he dies. But with that, let's stand.